It's a lot of material.
Yeah. I didn't realize it initially, but yeah, once I started reading, it was like a big web of huge papers.
Sure.
Yeah. So I kind of put overviews at many places, not going into those rabbit holes.
Sure. Well, why don't we turn it over to you? Because there's lots of conversation.
Yeah. So let's get started. I'm also recording the audio. I'm hoping all of you guys are fine with that. Uh, so, number one, before I start, I'm sure when I'm covering specific topics in the presentation, it goes through Aural, machine learning, catastrophic forgetting, and then some neuroscience, psychology. So it spans a huge space. And I'm sure on any specific topic, there'll be people who know much more than me. So please feel free to pitch in or add something to the stuff that I say. So we're going to cover the paper Reinforcement Learning Fast and Slow today. So this is a paper by DeepMind in May, and it's more like a review paper and making an argument that reinforcement learning is close to is not very far away from what the brain is actually doing. And a lot of research that they quote is quite again it's a lot of DeepMind papers that they quote. So I think DeepMind is doing a lot of work in this space. So the concepts are technically advanced and we have diverse audience. So I'll be focusing more on intuitions than going into the specifics of each of the algorithms. So this is the overview of the paper. So a common critique that people have against deep Aural is that it is sample inefficient and hence cannot model how the human brain learns. And this paper is mainly a counter to that argument. They describe new techniques in deep Aural that learn with fewer samples, and they give evidence and quote multiple research papers saying that this is not too far off from the brain. They also argue that this helps in neuroscience and psychology. They say that this points to interesting hypotheses that help us understand neuroanatomy, representations of brain, biological basis of intelligence, evolution, and many other ideas more clearly. So let's start with a few background ideas so that all of us are on the same page. So let's talk about inductive bias first. This is how I like to think about inductive bias. Let's say we're doing a binary image classification task. Can I move this? Okay, that's fine. Let's say we're working on a binary image classification task where your input is of size 100 by 100, and each pixel takes a value between 0 and 255. And so you have to map this input image onto 0 or 1 because it's a binary classification problem. And if you think about the number of possible functions that do this mapping, the math comes out to be very large. It comes out to be 256 power 100 into 100. And that's a huge number because the number of atoms in the universe are just 10 power 80. So this is a really big number. And so let's consider this bigger square. This bigger square is all possible functions that map from this input image to a binary class. And so each point is a function in the space. So we have a lot of hypothesis functions, a lot of things that would fit any kind of data set that we see. One way to narrow down the space in which we are searching for the function is to use a neural network. And a neural network is a very small, it's like a small point in this huge space, but this is not to scale. So I'm just plotting various, I'm plotting a bigger square here. So the bigger square represents all possible functions that a neural network can approximate. And a smaller square inside that is what convolutional networks can approximate. So when we are going from neural network to convolutional network, we're making additional assumptions about your data set, such as locality, symmetry in space, and so on. So that kind of narrows down the possible functional space that we're searching for. which makes learning easier. So the idea of including these architectural changes to narrow down your hypothesis set is one way to think about inductive bias. So now let's say we are training a convolutional network on the binary classification task. Let's say we're doing cats versus dogs. When we initialize the convolutional network, let's say the weights are W, we initialize it at a specific point in the space. And when we do gradient descent or stochastic gradient descent, we keep changing the value of W as we keep sending in batches and doing backdrop and updating the weights. So we're slowly moving along the space to a specific point where we're going to a specific point that is a good function approximation for the task. And let's say this is how we do cats versus dogs. And let's move on to a different task. Let's do apples versus oranges. For that, let's say we initialize the network here. And as we keep updating the weights, we are again moving. And it ends up here. And let's say we do a series of natural image classification tasks like this. The general tendency is that when you randomly initialize the weights and learn, you tend to go inside a smaller space. You can interrupt me if you have any comments or questions. Now we know that if we are doing natural image classification, your solutions generally tend to lie in a smaller set. So if we can somehow incorporate the bias that your solutions to natural images lie in a smaller set, then you can learn more efficiently because your set of hypothesis function is much smaller now. So in inductive bias can be incorporated in multiple ways. One way is through changing architectures like we did with neural networks and convolutional networks. And meta-learning is another way in which you actually learn this bias. And meta-learning is quite diverse and different algorithms use different approaches, but this is a common way to think about it, but it's not constant across all meta-learning algorithms. But the general idea is that you have a meta-learner. You have two aspects. You have a meta-learner and you have a learner. So the meta-learner tries to see the trends across various tasks and incorporate that bias. Let's call it theta. And then you have a learner that fine-tunes on a specific task to reach the optima. So yeah, this is an interesting way in which I like to think about meta-learning. So yeah, once we use meta-learning, CNN needs thousands of images. Once you incorporate this kind of bias, you can train it in just few images. So it gives you really strong performance. And some more background. So inductive bias is making assumptions about training data to generalize better. In the previous example, we made the assumption that we are working in the domain of natural images. And then let's talk about catastrophic forgetting. This happens when your neural network is trained with non-IID samples. They forget the samples that are not constantly repeated. For example, if you train a network on cats versus dogs, and then you're training it again on apples versus oranges. If you keep continuously training it, sending it batch of apples and oranges, and not showing it dogs and cats anymore, the network parameters would tune in such a way that it forgets cats versus dogs. Deep Aural is the use of deep neural networks for function approximation in Aural, and it's generally used to approximate policy or value function. And these are two terms used in the paper, slow learning and fast learning. So let's define those terms before we get in. So they define slow learning as sample inefficient learning, This happens when you learn using incremental parameter updates. And one example where this happens is when you're training a CNN on a classification task. You need multiple presentations of cats and dogs before it classifies it well, because you're doing a small grade, you're taking very small gradient steps at the beginning. And they contrast this with the idea of fast learning, where you do not have incremental updates. And one example of such an algorithm is k-nearest neighbors. So in k-nearest neighbors, when you look at something, you just put it in your memory, and each time you have a new sample, you compare it with what's in your memory. So you're using each sample in the most efficient way possible. You don't have to see the same stimulus again and again to be efficient. Just one image is enough. So these are two contrasting ways of learning, and deep neural networks generally learn slow. So a little bit of background on Aural. So these are the pseudocodes for prediction and control in temporal difference learning from Sutton. Just to review in case some of you forgot, prediction is when you want to find the value function for a given policy, and you continuously take actions based on that policy, and you use this update equation. Control pretty much does the same, but instead of following a fixed policy, you follow an epsilon greedy policy based on your present Q values. So what are the problems with this approach? Problem number one is, how do you choose the value of alpha? If you choose the value of alpha as too low, your learning becomes too slow. But if you choose a high value of alpha, you have catastrophic forgetting. And another problem is, this is a general framework that works across all domains. We're not including any kind of meta bias that we were seeing in one of the previous slides. So our hypothesis function is quite huge. So background completed, let's get into the paper.
Yep. Just one comment. So you're talking about fast versus slow learning.
Yep.
Maybe one thing to point out is that Aural is much more simple and efficient than normal deep learning. So when we're training with reinforcement learning, or when you're getting sort of one bit of a feedback signal that you get. So it takes a lot of examples, a lot of taking actions and seeing what happens to learn, versus in supervised learning where you have the whole target.
Right.
Yeah.
So
just want to point that out as like why we're talking about this in the context of reinforcement learning in particular.
Yeah. That's a good point, that in supervised learning we have batches ready, but in reinforcement learning you have to constantly interact with the environment and get each data point one by one.
Also, I would claim that the k-nearest neighbors has the difficulty of having to learn what a distance is. Like, you don't get it for free, like compared to...
We don't get what for free?
Well, if I compare somebody's face with somebody's face shifted by 1 pixel left...
KNNs would fail, yeah.
So there is
it doesn't...
still something to be learned about. I mean, there's still something that you don't get for free, and you don't get necessarily fast learning by memorizing everything, though.
I agree with you that learning is not efficient. That... you're not, when you're using KNN, you're not encoding spatial invariance, rotational invariance, anything.
Well, that's not really true. Like, if you shift someone's face 1 pixel to the left, you can make the assumption that images are locally similar, so every slow thing has a bigger match. So we can,
yeah, that's a good point, yeah.
You mean in k-nearest neighbors?
Right, you'd be encoding your bias in there to help the thing learn faster.
But that touches the problem of representation rather than the process of learning. It's like two different things. I think in the paper, what they claim is that representation learning, that's not something that's going to happen at the fast learning step. It's going to be across the slow learning step. So you can think about this k-nearest neighbor is going to be fast, but the representation you're going to use for this k-nearest neighbor is going to simply be learning up to slow learning.
Yeah, that was very well put. That slow learning helps you learn how to encode your feature space better, and once you have a very good feature space, KNN can easily differentiate in the feature space. Anything else? So sample inefficiency in Aural. So Lake and colleagues in 2017 published this paper comparing deep Aural with how humans learn, and this scale gives you the number of hours taken for learning, and this gives you the points. Humans do very well in less than an hour, while different variations of deep networks take a lot of time. And this is the vanilla DQN published in 2015, and it's unable to learn also. So they use this as an argument for saying that humans are learning this fast, your algorithms are learning too slow. So deep RL might not be a good way to model human learning. So why is it sample inefficient? So the paper quotes two main reasons why it is sample inefficient. Number one is that you're doing incremental parameter updates. So you need to learn 1 million parameters by slowly traversing through this minima, slowly traversing to find the minima, and you might have to sometimes rehearse again and again to avoid catastrophic forgetting. And another problem is weak inductive bias, where we have a general purpose algorithm that works across all tasks and learns from scratch every time. And it doesn't generalize across tasks. It doesn't use information from one task to learn better on another task. And they propose solutions for both the problems. So solution for incremental parameter updates is episodic deep RL, and solution for weak inductive bias is meta RL. And then they also show results of combining both the approaches. And so let's get into episodic RL, and let's talk about prediction case for now before we move on to control. So this is how it learns. So each time you are traversing through the trajectory, you remember your state and also the cumulative rewards from that point on. So pretty much an estimate of the value function. And you do it across multiple trajectories in the space. And so you're following a fixed policy right now because it's the prediction case. And each time you see a new state, how you estimate the value of that state is by comparing it with a similarity metric with all the points that you have in your memory. So when you see a new state, you compare it with everything in your memory. It's more similar to some, less similar to some states. So you appropriately weigh them, have an get the estimate for these value functions, and do a weighted average to get the value estimate for your state. And the claim is that this is sample efficient because it makes good use of all samples. You don't need multiple presentations of the same thing to learn. So extending episodic RL for the control case, I'll show you the results first before we go on to the pseudocode. So we're concerned about the red curve and the blue line. So they are the ones that are variations of episodic control. EC is episodic control. And they're applying it on a range of Atari-like tasks. And they show the initial learning curves of all across multiple tasks. And there is a general trend that these episodic-based learners learn faster. So they're more sample efficient. It doesn't work in some tasks, but there's a general trend that they're more sample efficient. And this is the pseudocode for, so there are many variations of how people implement this in practice. This is the pseudocode from the paper that implemented this on Atari, but I think there are variations of it based on the environment. And the pseudocode is similar in flavor to how you would extend TD from prediction to control. So you keep taking greedy actions and update your values based on that. So that's how episodic control helps learn faster. And next, let's talk about solving the weak inductive bias problem using Matata. So before going into meta-learning in agents, let's talk about meta-learning in animals. So this is a task given to a monkey in 1949 by Harlow. And I think he's a controversial guy in the field where he did a lot of unethical experiments with monkeys. And yeah, thankfully this experiment is not that unethical. So, and the task is this. So the monkey is presented with two objects and it has to choose one of these objects. So under each object, there is a small well and you have food placed or not placed. So the monkey has to learn to associate the object with the reward under it. So you do this over multiple episodes and multiple trials. I'll tell you the difference between what happens across episodes and across trials. So I'm not sure if you can see this clearly, but there are 6 trials in each episode and you have hundreds of episodes. So what happens across these 6 trials is you randomly switch the place of both the objects, but you always keep the reward under the same object. And across different episodes, you give the monkey new objects that it has never seen before. So so each episode has a new pair of objects, and the monkey it has to learn to associate the structure of this task. That there are multiple possible hypothesis sets for the monkey. The monkey, if in trial 1 it sees a reward under at its left, it shouldn't assume that it is always at the left. It should make this association about the structure of the task that the object is associated with food. So as you keep training it across multiple episodes, so each of this line is an average of a few episodes. So as the episodes keep increasing, its accuracy on how well it can pick the food increases. And after training for hundreds of episodes, around 300 episodes, what you see is, so what happens in the 300th episode? You have completely new objects and the monkey has to figure out under which object the food is. So it can only do as best as guessing in the first trial, but once it guesses in the first trial, irrespective of whether it gets it right or wrong, it figures out under which object the resin should be in all the following trials. So it scores almost 100% accuracy on everything else. So this is how monkeys are able to generalize across different tasks. Here we are looking at each episode as a different task. And again, a slight reminder on Aural. So we're trying to cut down this hypothesis set, trying to make it smaller, and we have a meta learner that kind of biases your solutions in this direction, and you have a learner that quickly adapts to your specific task. So if you think of MAML, which is a specific meta-learning algorithm, it almost does exactly this. So it learns better weight initializations for your network to learn better. So in that case, theta would learn to initialize it inside the circle so that convergence is much faster. So this is the architecture of Meta-Aural, and it is very similar to what we have already discussed, except that instead of an image classification task, we are doing Aural across environments. So the parameter theta would remember the consistency across different environments, while phi is the parameter that the agent learns as it interacts with the environment. And I'm not going into the architectural details of how all of this is done, but in general, you parameterize theta using a recurrent network, and the agent uses any traditional learning algorithm. So it can either use episodic Aural or a DQL. So this is a variation of the Harlows task that we saw earlier on a actual agent. So this is the video input that the agent gets. So the agent is trying to move left or right based on patches that it sees on the screen. And these are ImageNet patches. And the task is very similar. It has to figure out the right image to look at, which is similar to the monkey trying to pick up the right object. And when you see how they both fare against each other, the learning over episodes seems to have a consistent pattern. It's quite similar to the behavioral learning pattern of a monkey. So, I mean, this is still not clear evidence that the brain is actually doing this, but we know that we're not completely shooting off. There's some kind of consistency between the brain and how animals learn. So that's how meta-learning can be used to induce stronger bias. And episodic RL is fast, but meta-RL is slow because generally when you're training the RNN, you use incremental updates to train your theta. Oops, sorry. So next, let's see about how episodic RL and meta-RL can be combined. But before that, if you have any questions or points to discuss on, we can. Yeah.
Can you just remind me again what's the gist of what they're doing in that paper? Is it just that
This
they're
one?
training? No, the one that I had previously. Sorry, the Wang paper. Is it just that they're training their RNN on multiple tasks from the environment and that regularizes the parameters internally?
That's right.
Okay.
Even I'm not very clear on the exact details, but yeah, you use this parameter to instantiate your agent. So this encodes regularity across environments, and when you instantiate an agent when you're coming across a new environment, this remembers domain knowledge across, and this would have to fine tune on that specific task.
Okay, so it's about setting the initial parameters for the agent.
Yeah, that is one kind of meta-learning algorithm. There's a broad range of things people do. So finding the initial parameter is one way of doing meta-RL. And this specific paper, I'm actually not very sure which approach they use. I'm not sure if they use this theta exactly as the initialization parameters. That is what is done in the context of mammal.
I don't remember exactly how the Wang paper is doing it, but there's another paper which is RL squared, which is RL, fast RL with slow RL, something like that, which came out around the same time, where they use basically two RNNs, one which is going to be across different episodes, and one which is going to be at the level of a single episode. And so you have your internal representation across an episode, which is going to help the representation for the latent, not the latent, but the hidden representation of your RNN for your at the level of a single task. So you have like one which is across different tasks, and then you have the RNN which is only at the level of a single task. And then this RNN which is across different tasks, it has its hidden representation which is going to be updated as it sees more and more samples. And this hidden state is going to help the representation for the level of a single task. So it's not really initialization based, it's more about using the model itself, the RNN itself, to help the learning process.
So next, let's talk about combining episodic and meta-RL, which is exactly same as meta-RL, except that your agent uses episodic RL that we've seen. And this is the results on one of the papers, and it turns out that when you use episodic RL instead of just episodic meta RL instead of just meta RL, you have better performance. So we've covered episodic RL, meta RL, and episodic meta RL. We get maybe more sample efficiency. So what? So these are the implications part of the paper, which I found the hardest to read through, because every little paragraph has 4 big papers, and it had a lot of technical depth, and I didn't know so much neuroscience, and so yeah, I'm just quoting specific points from the implications, but you should take a closer look at the paper if you want to learn more. So the common argument is that deep RL is sample inefficient, and hence it cannot model human learning. The author counters saying that latest RL techniques are sample efficient. So this argument is not good enough to remove deep RL as a candidate for model of human learning. And they talk about episodic RL, and they say that how episodic RL learns is quite similar to instance-based models of human memory, and that evidence suggests that the brain also does something very similar. It estimates value based on values from the past observations. I haven't had time to go into how they are making this claim in the papers. I think they quoted 4 different papers just for this. So, yeah. And then with meta-RL, they talk about a paper where the paper proposes a direct mapping between meta-RL and different structures in the brain. And they say that recurrent networks centered on PFC, the prefrontal cortex, implements fast learning. And the slow learning part doesn't only span across a single lifespan, but also on an evolutionary time scale. Again, lots of references, not going into them. And this points to interesting hypotheses in various fields to understand humans better, evolutionary biology and stuff like that. And they also acknowledge that human learning likely involves much more than what has been presented here. But they say this is a good starting point to test out more hypotheses in these fields and learn more about how the human brain works. And that is all.